This is up. I'm David Gura. As lawmakers on the House Intelligence Committee prepare to question the acting director of National Intelligence, who decided not to bring a whistleblower complaint to their attention, despite his statutory obligation to do so, President Trump and his allies are trying to do two things. One is to justify that phone call with Ukraine's new president. And two, they're trying to suggest Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, deserves more scrutiny. Well, Adam Entous is a staff writer for The New Yorker who profiled Hunter Biden in a recent issue of that magazine. He writes, there is little question that Hunter's proximity to power shaped the arc of his career, and that, as the former aide told me, Hunter is super rich terrain. But Donald J. Trump and some of his allies, in their eagerness to undermine Biden's candidacy and possibly to deflect attention from their own ethical lapses, have gone to extreme lengths, promoting without evidence the dubious narrative that Biden used the office of the vice president to advance and protect his son's interests. Adam Entous joins us now. Adam, great to have you here. The president just addressed this, raised these specious allegations yet again in comments that he made on the South Lawn of the White House. And I hate to have you synthesize this incredibly long and wonderful profile of Hunter Biden in such a short amount of time. But is there any there as you see this story rearing its head once again?
Yeah. Well, I would say the question is what do we mean by there?
Yes.
Hunter obviously is the son of Joe Biden. He's got a famous last name, and he was offered a very lucrative deal with a Ukrainian company in 2014, had him on the board at the same time that his father was, driving U.S. policy in Ukraine with an agenda of cracking down on corruption. So that was a questionable, legitimate. There's legitimate questions to be asked about the wisdom of Hunter's decision to do that and why Biden's top aides decided not to intervene to try to get Hunter to step down from that seat. That is, I think, a legitimate source of inquiry and discussion. On the issue of whether or not Joe Biden later in 2016 used the power of the vice presidency to try to ask the government of Ukraine to remove the prosecutor because this is the accusation that's being made here, because that prosecutor was investigating Burisma, this is the company that was employing Hunter, and Hunter. I found no evidence to back that up and much evidence to the contrary. It appears, based on my reporting, that the oligarch who runs Burisma felt protected when Shokin, which is the prosecutor we're talking about here, was actually in office. And when Biden actually had him removed or pressured to have him removed, that's actually when the oligarch left the country because then he was concerned that he was no longer protected. So what I found is quite contrary to this allegation in terms of the vice president, firing this particular prosecutor because he was trying to protect his son for some reason.
Tim Bryan, I want you to react to that. And Peter Schweitzer, who the president is fond of quoting when he can spell his last name correctly, he misspelled it in the first tweet last night, got it right in the second one, talks about, and Adam brings this up in his piece, corruption by proxy. And that is the look of this happening, or it happening inadvertently, there being some sort of corruption.
Yeah, but there's nothing in the fact pattern, and as Adam correctly points out, that Hunter Biden was on the board of a company that was under investigation. It doesn't appear that it was under investigation.
Right.
It wasn't Hunter Biden's company. He was a board member. Board members at most companies are pretty passive actors. They're not at the heart and soul of how a company operates. There's no reason to believe, actually, that this is an issue that should be put on the same level right now as Trump trying to solicit favors from the head of a foreign power.
Adam Entous, you got a shelf of prizes. I know that you were one of the best investigative reporters, and I wonder, as you undertook this investigation, as you wrote this piece, were there any walls that you hit? As we see the specter raised here of more investigations, are there things that you were unable to mine or things that haven't been able to have been answered here?
Yeah. Well, let me go back actually to something that the previous speaker just said.
Jim O'Brien, yes.
Yeah. So Burisma actually was under investigation in 2014. The Obama administration and the vice president were supporting that investigation. It was being conducted. Funds of this oligarch were frozen in England from bank account funds, and it was the policy of the Obama administration of Joe Biden, even though Hunter was on the board at that point, starting in April 2014, they were pushing the Ukrainians to investigate Burisma and this particular oligarch. And what happened is that in December 2014, the prosecutor's office at the time, Shokin was not involved. He wasn't put to this position of prosecutor until later. They basically dismissed the case, and the Obama administration, represented, Biden is part of, obviously, was very angry and put a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians. They dropped this case. They saw this as a violation of American efforts to combat corruption. So there was an investigation backed by the Obama administration and Joe Biden of the company that was employing Hunter, and that was in 2014.
But Adam, describe that investigation in specifics. What were they looking at, and what was the timeline on it?
So it was launched in 2014, around the spring of 2014. They were looking at whether or not the owner of, or the co-owner of Burisma, Zlochevsky, used his previous position as ecology minister in the government of Ukraine in order to get export licenses that were then given to Burisma. So in other words,
but that was 2 years prior to Biden then putting pressure on the Ukrainians to limit corruption, right?
No,
By the time that Biden went over there to do that, that
Yeah.
investigation was no longer in play, correct?
Correct. But my point is that the Obama administration was encouraging the Ukrainians to investigate Burisma. The allegation is that the Obama administration, through Biden, later had tried to get them to drop the investigation. These are contradictory positions. That's why I'm saying it doesn't make sense, these allegations. Sure. I'm just trying to correct the point about whether or not Burisma was under investigation. This was a U.S.-backed investigation in 2014 of Burisma.
I encourage everyone to read this profile again of Hunter Biden from the July 1st issue of The New Yorker. I'll put a link out to it on Twitter. Adam Entis of The New Yorker, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.